Good evening, and welcome back. Or, if this is your first night finding your way here, welcome, plain and simple. My name isn't the important part of this hour together. What matters is that I spent a working life around concrete and steel and the people who put them there, and these days I spend my nights telling their stories slowly, for anyone who'd rather drift off than stay sharp. Tonight's story is a long, unhurried one, so get yourself settled before we begin. Turn the light down if you haven't already. Pull whatever needs pulling up around you. Set your phone face down somewhere you won't be tempted to check it again tonight. There's nothing else waiting for you. If you feel like it, leave a comment telling me where in the world you're listening from and what time it is there where you are. I like imagining all the different nights this reaches all at once scattered across the dark half of the planet. Then let that thought go, settle your head into the pillow and come with me to a road that climbs so high above a river valley in the south of France that on certain mornings, the valley itself simply isn't there anymore. Picture the rail of that road, if you can, and imagine leaning against it, looking down, expecting to find fields, a river, rooftops, and finding only white. A slow drift of cloud sitting in the bottom of the valley the way water settles in the bottom of a bowl, moving so gently you could watch it for an hour and still not be certain it had moved at all. Somewhere far beneath that cloud, hidden entirely from you, is an actual river and a town, and a road that once carried a slow, grinding column of cars and trucks down one side of the valley and back up the other. A road so overloaded in summer that whole afternoons could vanish into it. The bridge that solved that problem, the one you're standing on in this picture, is the Millau Viaduct, thrown across the valley of the River Tarn, and for a stretch of years before newer towers elsewhere climbed past it, the tallest of its masts, the tall, thin towers rising from its piers into open air, stood higher than the Eiffel Tower. Not the roadway beneath your feet, not the deck you'd be driving across. The mast above it, rising out of a pier that was already taller than almost anything else built by hand on the continent, climbing past the height of one of the most famous towers on Earth as though that were nothing unusual at all. There is nothing you need to hold on to here, no measurements to memorize, no way this story can quiz you on any of it later. You can let the shape of it move through you the way that cloud moves through the valley below, slow and without hurry. And if your eyes have already started to close, that is exactly the right thing to be doing right now. This bridge did not arrive by accident, and it certainly did not arrive quickly. Its final shape came out of two very different minds, working for a while almost against each other, and then, eventually, together. One belonged to an engineer named Michel Virlogeux, a man who had already spent years solving problems most engineers preferred to leave alone. The sort of person who looks at an impossible valley and starts sketching quietly, before anyone official has actually asked him to. The other belonged to an architect, Norman Foster, brought in later to take Virlogeux's structural idea and give it a silhouette worth looking at from every farmhouse for miles around, a shape light enough that it wouldn't sit in the valley like a wall, but seem instead to hover above it. And down on the ground, once the drawings became a real site full of real mud and real noise, there was a foreman, one of many who ran sites like this one, his name not among those the record kept for us, but his kind unmistakable on every major project of that era, the man walking the boards before first light, checking harnesses, counting heads at the end of a shift, carrying in his own memory the 1,000 small decisions no drawing ever shows. These three, in different ways, are the people this story keeps circling back to, so hold each of them loosely as we go. You'll meet all three again before the night is over. Before we go further into that valley, if you're finding this kind of slow telling agreeable, you're welcome to subscribe to the channel. There are other bridges, other rivers, other long nights like this one waiting whenever you need them. I'll only mention it this once, gently. And now we can get back to the valley itself, where the real trouble begins. The valley, if you had stood in it long before any bridge existed, would have felt like the floor of a green, quiet world entirely its own. Steep wooded sides falling away on either hand, steep wooded sides falling away on either hand, a river moving slow and green along the bottom, and a silence broken only by wind and birds and, later, by the occasional cough of an engine somewhere on the switchback road that crossed it. That town at the valley's edge, the one that gave the bridge its name, is called Millau, an old place built on wool and leather, and the kind of quiet you only find in towns that have never needed to grow very fast. For most of its history, it had been perfectly content with that quiet. The trouble began only when the rest of the country decided it needed to pass straight through the middle of it to get somewhere else. You have to picture the map for a moment, though not with any numbers attached to it, just the shape of the thing. A long road runs down through the middle of France, connecting the north of the country to Spain, carrying with it every summer a great slow migration of families heading south toward the coast for their holidays. For most of that road's length, the land cooperates. It rolls, it dips, it lets the traffic through without much complaint, and then it reaches this one valley, cut by the river Tarn, through a high limestone plateau called the Causse du Larzac, and the land simply stops cooperating. The plateau does not slope gently down to the river and back up the other side. It drops, and it drops hard, and then it climbs again just as hard on the far side, so that any road trying to cross it has no choice but to wind its way down one flank of the valley on a long, tight, switchbacking descent, cross the river at the bottom, and then claw its way back up the other side by the same slow method. Before the bridge, that descent and climb were handled by an old road threading straight through Millau itself, down through the town's own streets and out the other side, which meant that every single car and lorry making that summer migration toward the sun had to pass, at walking pace some days, directly through somebody's town. What does that actually look like in practice when you multiply it out across an entire August? It looks like a queue that starts before dawn and hasn't finished by dusk. It looks like a farmer trying to cross his own street to reach his own field, waiting 10 minutes for a gap in traffic that never quite arrives. It looks like a delivery van idling for the better part of an hour behind 3 lorries and a caravan, all of them crawling down through switchbacks meant for a much gentler century. There is no need to remember any of that in detail, only to feel for a moment the shape of the frustration, the sense of a whole nation's summer traffic being poured drop by drop through the neck of a single narrow bottle. The people of Millau had a name for it, spoken without much affection. The bouchon, the cork, the thing that stopped the bottle from pouring. On the worst days, it could take the better part of 4 hours to cover a stretch of road that should have taken 20 minutes on a clear morning, and those 4 hours were spent not moving, or moving in the smallest increments, engines running, windows down, children asleep against door frames, the smell of hot tarmac and exhaust settling into the valley alongside all that usual quiet green stillness the place had known for centuries before any road ever found it. It is worth sitting with that contrast for a moment. The valley itself unchanged beneath it all, river still moving at the same unhurried pace it always had, trees still doing what trees do, and laid directly on top of that timeless picture, a very modern kind of suffering. Thousands of people, every single summer, trapped in their own cars, going nowhere for hours at a stretch. Somewhere in one of those queues, more summers than anyone would care to count, sat the kind of driver this story never gets to name. A woman, say, with 2 children strapped into the back seat, sunburned already from the drive so far, watching the temperature gauge on the dashboard creep steadily upward as the engine idled in place for the 40th minute in a row. She is not a documented figure. No one wrote her name down. No journalist interviewed her for the paper, and yet anyone who lived through those years in that part of France would recognize her instantly, because she was, in one form or another, almost everyone who passed through that valley in August. She is worth holding in your mind for a moment now, because she is the entire reason any of what follows in this story happened at all. Every foundation later sunk into that valley floor, every ton of steel later hoisted into the sky above it, traces back, in the end, to people exactly like her, stuck exactly where she was, wanting nothing more complicated than a road that simply let them through. It took the French government the better part of the final decades of the last century to properly admit that the problem wasn't going away on its own, that no amount of traffic management or clever signage down through Millau's old streets was ever going to solve what was, at its core, a problem of geography rather than of driving. The valley itself was the obstacle. As long as every car heading south had to go down into it and back up out of it on the old road, the queues would return every summer like weather, as reliable as the cloud that settles into the valley floor on quiet mornings, even now. If the road could not go through the valley without disaster, then perhaps, someone eventually reasoned, it did not have to go through the valley at all. Perhaps it could go over it instead, not skirting the edge, not winding down and climbing back up, but crossing the whole gap in one continuous motion, high above the river, high above the cloud, high above the little town that had spent so many summers choking on exhaust fumes from the traffic passing through its own front doors. It was, on paper, a wonderfully simple idea. It would also turn out to be one of the most demanding engineering problems anyone in the country had faced in a generation, because a valley of that width and that depth does not simply allow itself to be crossed because someone has decided it would be convenient, long before any mast rose into the sky above it, long before Virlogeux ever sharpened a pencil over the first sketch of a solution. That valley would need to be measured, argued over, doubted, and very nearly abandoned more than once. And that argument is where we're headed next. Picture the valley first, because everything else in this story sits inside it. The Tarn River has spent longer than anyone can properly account for cutting itself down through the limestone plateaus of that part of southern France. And what it left behind is not a gentle dip in the land, but a deep, green, almost secretive gash, walled in on both sides by slopes that rise steeply enough to make the sky above seem narrower than it should. If you had stood at the bottom of it on the valley floor near the town of Millau and looked straight up, you would have felt small in a way that has nothing to do with modesty and everything to do with geology. The town itself sits where two rivers meet, tucked into that gap in the plateau like something set down carefully into a groove. And for a very long time, that town was not a destination so much as an obstacle. Everyone heading south from Paris toward the Mediterranean coast and onward into Spain had to go through it, because the plateaus on either side offered no other sensible way across. There is nothing you need to hold on to here except that single image. A whole country's worth of summer traffic funneled down into one narrow valley, with nowhere to go but through the middle of a town that was never built to hold it. For decades before any bridge existed, that funnel did exactly what funnels do. Through the warmer months, when half of northern Europe seemed to decide on the same week to drive toward the sun, the road down into the valley and back up the other side became something between an inconvenience and a small, slow-motion catastrophe that repeated itself every year like clockwork. You would have come down off the plateau on a road that switched back on itself again and again, losing height in tight, deliberate turns, engines groaning in low gear, brakes working harder than their drivers probably wanted to think about. At the bottom, the road crossed the river and ran directly through Millau itself, along streets that had been laid out for a town, not for a river of cars stretching back for what felt like whole afternoons. And then, having crossed, you would have had to climb straight back out again, up the far wall of the valley, on a road just as narrow and just as unforgiving as the one that brought you down. 2 climbs, 1 descent, 1 crossing, and somewhere in the middle of it, a town trying to go about its ordinary business while tens of thousands of vehicles idled through its center on the hottest days of the year. The toll this took was not abstract, and it was not only measured in lost time, though the lost time alone was considerable enough that people spoke of it the way you might speak of weather, an accepted, unavoidable feature of traveling south in August. Queues on the worst days stretched back along the approach roads for hours, and inside those queues sat families with children asleep against car windows, delivery drivers watching schedules slip away from them, holiday makers who had budgeted a certain number of hours for the whole journey, and now found half a day of it swallowed by a single valley. If you had been driving that road yourself, tired from hours already on the motorway, you would have felt the particular fatigue of a driver who has stopped moving but cannot properly rest, inching forward a car length at a time, engine ticking over, heat coming up off the tarmac in visible waves. And beneath the frustration sat something harder to dismiss. The roads themselves, with their tight bends and their steep grades, were not especially forgiving of a driver whose attention had worn thin after hours of stop and start. Accidents on that stretch were not rare, and the town's own streets, never designed to carry a national artery of traffic through their center, absorbed a wear and a risk that had nothing to do with anything the town itself had asked for. There is no need to dwell on any of that too closely tonight, only to understand that Millau had been living inside someone else's traffic problem for a very long time, and that everybody involved, drivers and townspeople alike, knew it could not simply go on being solved by patience. So how does a country finally decide that a problem it has lived with for generations is worth solving properly, rather than simply enduring for another decade? That is really where this next part of the story begins, because the pressure that eventually produced an answer did not arrive suddenly. It built the way pressure usually does in these situations, slowly from more than one direction at once, until it became harder to ignore than to address. Through the later decades of the 20th century, France was in the middle of an enormous, sustained effort to knit its regions together with a modern network of motorways, the kind of infrastructure project that unfolds over generations rather than years. One stretch of road connecting to the next until what had been a patchwork of regional routes became something closer to a single, continuous system running the length and breadth of the country. The route south, from Paris down through the center of the country toward the Mediterranean and on to the Spanish border, was one of the most heavily used corridors in that whole network. And it had, for a very long time, one obvious gap in it, the valley at Millau, where the great sweep of the motorway simply stopped being a motorway, dropped down into switchbacks, and became a town's own local streets for a few kilometers before climbing back out and resuming its proper character on the far side. Every planner who looked at that gap saw the same thing, a bottleneck sitting squarely across one of the busiest north-south arteries in the country, growing worse every summer as the volume of tourist and freight traffic climbed. The economic argument for fixing it was not difficult to make, and it was made repeatedly by regional authorities and national planners who watched the congestion figures rise year after year and understood what a corridor like that was worth if it could simply be allowed to flow. But economic arguments alone rarely move a project of this size from a line on a planning document to an actual hole in the ground. And what eventually tipped the balance was the accumulation of frustration on every side, from drivers who complained, from the town of Millau itself, which had grown tired of hosting a national traffic jam through its own center every summer, and from a broader political appetite, building through the final years of the century for the kind of grand infrastructure project that a country could point to with pride once it was finished. The idea that had been discussed in various forms for years began to sharpen into something more specific. Not a wider road through the valley, not an improved set of switchbacks, but a crossing that would carry traffic clean over the top of the whole valley, high enough that the road would barely notice the ground had ever fallen away beneath it. A viaduct, in other words, though nobody yet knew what shape that viaduct would take, or whether the valley would even permit one. It was into this slowly sharpening ambition that the name Michel Virlogeux began to enter the conversation. And if you have never heard that name before, it is worth sitting with for a moment, because you will hear it again more than once before this story is finished. By the time Milau's crossing became a serious proposition rather than a hopeful sketch, Virlogeux was already one of the most respected bridge engineers working in France, a man whose reputation had been built not on any single spectacular structure, but on a career spent solving exactly this kind of problem. How to carry a road across a gap that seemed, at first glance, unreasonable to cross at all. He had already worked on other major French bridges by this point, and the engineering establishment in France, which does not hand out its trust casually, had come to regard him as precisely the sort of person you brought in when a crossing needed to be not merely possible, but elegant, safe, and buildable within a lifetime. When the question of Millau moved from political will into technical reality, it was natural that his name would be attached to it early, and it was under his direction that the first serious studies into what kind of structure the valley might actually accept began to take shape. And somewhere around that same period, from further away, another name began to drift into the story. Quietly at first, the way names often do before anyone realizes how central they will become. Norman Foster was, by this point, already known well beyond France, an architect whose practice in Britain had built a reputation for buildings and structures that treated engineering itself as a kind of visible poetry rather than something to be hidden behind decoration. His name entering the conversation around Millau was, at this early stage, little more than a murmur, a sense among some of the people involved that a crossing of this ambition might benefit from an eye trained not only in structural necessity, but in the pure visual question of how such a thing should look, set against a landscape as dramatic as the Tarn Valley. Nobody yet knew what shape a partnership between an engineer of Virlogeux's background and an architect of Foster's inclination might take, or whether the two disciplines would even sit comfortably together on a project this large. If your eyes have started to grow heavy already, that uncertainty is a fine place to let them close for a moment, because none of it needed solving all at once. It needed time and argument, and a great many drawings that would never be built. What was becoming clear to everyone circling the problem from their different directions was that solving Millau's Valley properly would not be a matter of choosing a single obvious answer off a shelf. The scale of the gap being considered, the depth of the drop, the width of the crossing all pushed the problem well past anything that could be handled with a conventional design pulled from a standard engineering textbook. If a structure was going to leap the whole width of that valley, carrying a live, high-speed motorway hundreds of feet above a river that most days looked more like a quiet green ribbon than an obstacle worth crossing, then whoever built it would be pushing against limits that very few bridges anywhere in the world had ever been asked to test. That realization is what eventually pushed the whole question toward a proper competition, an invitation put out to engineers and architects across France and beyond to propose an answer to a problem that did not yet have an agreed shape, only an agreed location and an agreed refusal to accept switchbacks and traffic jams as a permanent condition of crossing that valley. And it is in the shape of that competition and the arguments it produced that the next real turn of this story begins, because deciding that a bridge was needed turned out to be the easy part. Deciding what kind of bridge could actually stand in a place like that was a different question altogether, and it was not one that would be answered quickly, or without a great deal of doubt along the way. The call went out from the French Road Authority in the form of a competition brief, and if you had been one of the engineers or architects who received it, you would have felt the peculiar weight of a problem stated almost too simply. Cross the valley. Do it without switchbacks, without a bridge so low it would need 100 piers marching down into the gorge and back up the other side, without a structure so heavy with itself that it announced its own struggle before a single car had crossed it. The brief did not say elegant, not in so many words, but everyone who read it closely understood that elegance was quietly being asked for anyway. France had a long habit by then of wanting its great crossings to look as though they had arrived rather than been built, and the men and women judging the submissions carried that habit with them into every meeting, even when they never said it aloud. What came back from the design teams was a wide spread of ideas, and if you could have laid them all out on a single long table, the way the jury eventually did, you would have seen almost every serious way of crossing a valley that engineering had produced across the previous century. There were proposals for a low viaduct that would have dropped down into the gorge itself, threading along the valley floor before climbing out the far side, sparing the piers their great height, but asking drivers to descend into the very congestion the whole project was meant to erase. There were arch designs, muscular and confident, drawing on a French tradition of arched bridges that stretched back generations, each one proposing to leap the valley in a smaller number of much heavier jumps. There were suspension concepts too, cables slung in long, unbroken curves, borrowing from a lineage that included some of the most famous crossings on Earth. Each concept had its defenders, its calculations, its careful arguments for why it, and not the others, was the only reasonable way to close this particular gap in the map of France. Among the submissions was one built around an idea that had been forming for years in the mind of a French engineer named Michel Virlogeux, a man who had already spent a working life thinking about how bridges carry their loads and, more quietly, about how little of that effort needs to show on the outside. Virlogeux was drawn not to arches or suspension cables in their classic form, but to something more particular. a multi-span, cable-stayed structure, a bridge held up not by two great towers with cables sweeping the whole length between them, but by a whole family of slender masts, each one responsible only for its own portion of the crossing, each one standing on its own pier and reaching down with its own straight lines of cable to hold its own stretch of roadway aloft. It was not a new idea in principle. Cable-stayed bridges had been built before, plenty of them, carrying roads over rivers and harbors in cities all over the world. What was new, or nearly new, was the scale Virlogeux was quietly proposing to ask of it, and the particular emptiness of the place he wanted to hang it over. If you try to picture that idea as it must have looked on paper in those early months, before it had a shape anyone could stand under, it would have seemed almost too simple to solve the problem it was answering. A line of piers, evenly spaced, climbing up out of a valley that plunged far deeper than any valley such a bridge had crossed before. A mast rising from the top of each pier, slender rather than monumental, more like a ship's mast than a cathedral tower. Cables fanning down in two directions from each mast, catching the roadway at intervals and carrying its weight down through the mast and into the pier and down, at last, into the ground itself. It was an idea built on repetition and restraint rather than on a single heroic gesture, and that restraint was exactly what would eventually recommend it to the people judging the competition, though it would take considerable persuading before the boldness underneath that restraint stopped alarming them. You do not need to hold on to any of these names or numbers tonight if you would rather let them pass through you like water. It is enough to know that somewhere in the paperwork moving between drawing offices and government desks, a particular kind of bridge was slowly separating itself from the others. Not because it shouted loudest, but because it seemed to disappear most completely into the landscape it was meant to serve. But an idea for how a bridge should carry its load is not the same thing as an idea for how a bridge should look, and it was here, in the space between those two questions, that the competition took its most interesting turn. Virlogeux's structural concept was sound, and increasingly the engineers reviewing the submissions were coming to believe it was more than sound, that it might in fact be the only concept capable of crossing that valley without compromising either the traffic below or the horizon around it. But a design brief written by a national road authority, judged partly by architects and officials with an eye on how the finished structure would sit in photographs and postcards, and the memories of everyone who ever drove across it, was never going to be satisfied by engineering alone. It wanted proportion. It wanted a bridge that looked as though it had always belonged in that gap between the plateaus, rather than one that looked merely capable of standing there. This is how you find yourself, if you follow the story far enough, at the meeting between an engineer who had spent his career thinking in loads and spans and a British architect named Norman Foster, whose own career had been built on a very different but oddly compatible obsession. The idea that a structure could be made to look almost impossibly light, even when the physics beneath it was doing tremendous, unglamorous work to make that lightness possible. Foster had not come up through bridges the way Virlogeux had. His name was already known for buildings, for airports and towers and civic spaces, designed with a kind of pared-back clarity, structures that seemed to want as little material touching the sky as they could get away with. When his practice was drawn into the Millau competition, it was not because anyone doubted that Virlogeux's structural idea could hold a road aloft. It was because someone, somewhere in that process, understood that holding the road aloft and making the crossing feel effortless were two separate achievements, and that the second one needed its own kind of attention. What happened between them, in the months that followed, was not a rivalry, whatever the more dramatic tellings of this story sometimes suggest, but something closer to two disciplines discovering they wanted the same thing for entirely different reasons. Virlogeux wanted a structure efficient enough that its members could be as slender as the loads allowed, because slenderness, to an engineer of his kind, is very often simply the visible evidence of a calculation done well. Foster wanted a structure that read, from a distance, as a single continuous gesture rather than a sequence of separate parts, because to an architect of his sensibility, a bridge that looked assembled from pieces had already failed at something, however sound its mathematics. It turned out that these two desires, arrived at from opposite directions, pointed toward almost exactly the same bridge. The masts grew taller and thinner in the collaboration, not shorter and heavier. The piers, rather than being thickened for reassurance, were tapered and slightly curved, so that from certain angles they seemed to lean rather than simply stand, an illusion of movement in something that would never move at all. The roadway itself, the great steel ribbon the whole structure existed to support, was drawn as thin as the engineering would tolerate, so that from below, on a clear day, you would be able to see daylight along its edge. A line of sky under a line of steel, rather than the solid grey mass that lower, heavier bridges present to anyone standing beneath them. But how do you get an engineer's mathematics and an architect's eye to agree on the same drawing when one of them is thinking in tons and the other is thinking in silhouettes? The honest answer from everything that survives of that period is slowly and through a great many drawings that were made and unmade before the two visions settled into one. There were disagreements over proportion, over exactly how tall the masts should stand relative to the piers beneath them, over how the cables should be arranged so that they read from a passing car or a distant hillside as a clean fan of lines rather than a tangle. Virlogeux would push for a configuration his calculations preferred, and Foster's team would push back on how that configuration would appear at dusk from below against a sky beginning to darken over the Corsair. Neither side, by every account that has come down through the people who worked in those offices, treated the other as an obstacle. It was closer to two people rearranging the same room by different instincts, each willing to move a piece of furniture back to where the other had left it, until the whole arrangement stopped feeling like a compromise and started feeling inevitable. If your eyes have already begun to close somewhere in the middle of that description, that is exactly the right thing to have happen. There is no test at the end of this. What matters, if anything does, is the feeling of two very different kinds of care being folded slowly into the same set of drawings. What emerged from that folding together was a proposal that asked for something no bridge of its particular kind had ever been asked to do before. The piers being proposed would rise to a height that put them among the tallest ever built to carry a bridge deck, taller than towers that most cities would have been proud to call their tallest building outright, and they would do this not as isolated monuments but as a repeating family, march after march of them, striding the whole length of a valley that had previously belonged only to the river and the wind. When the drawings were shown, complete with the slender masts continuing upward from those already improbable piers, more than one person in the room is remembered as having gone quiet for a moment before asking, in one form or another, whether this was actually a bridge that could be built, or an image of a bridge that had gotten away from the people drawing it. It was a fair question. Nothing standing at that height, carrying that kind of load, swaying in that kind of wind, had been proven at that scale before. The confidence behind the proposal rested on calculation rather than precedent, and calculation, however careful, has always made certain kinds of people uneasy when the numbers involved are large enough to change the skyline of a region. You would not have needed to be an engineer to feel that unease if you had stood in the room where those drawings were unrolled. You would only have needed to look at the height marked beside the tallest pier and then imagine standing at the base of it, looking straight up, and understanding that this was meant to be one of several such piers, not the exception but the rule. It is one thing to build a single tall thing. It is another to propose a whole valley of them, each one required to behave exactly as its neighbors did, each one carrying its share of a roadway that would only work if every pier, every mast, every span of cable performed its part with something close to perfect agreement. And yet, when the jury finished its deliberations, it was this proposal, Virlogeux's structural logic married to Foster's architectural restraint, that was chosen from among all the arches and suspension spans and low valley floor crossings that had been submitted alongside it. Chosen, but not yet secured. A drawing selected by a jury is still only a drawing. However carefully it has been argued into existence, and there remained a considerable distance between an approved concept and a structure standing in steel and concrete over that gorge. Financing had to be found and defended. Rival concerns had to be answered, not once but repeatedly, by officials who would spend the better part of a decade being asked whether a road this expensive, this audacious, could really be justified by the traffic queues it was meant to erase. The valley itself had not yet been touched. Somewhere beneath the drawings, still waiting, was the actual ground the piers would have to stand on, ground that no one in that room had yet tested closely enough to promise it would hold what was being asked of it. The bridge in the drawings was beautiful, and by every account, those who saw it that day believed in some private way that it might actually be right. But belief of that kind, however widely shared, was about to meet a decade of doubt before a single foundation was allowed to be dug. You did not need to have stood in that room to feel what came next, because what came next was not drama. It was paperwork. It was meetings held in provincial offices with fluorescent lights and letters exchanged between ministries, and a folder that grew thicker every year without anyone quite deciding to open it and act. If you have ever waited on a decision that was not yours to make, waited long enough that you stopped checking for news of it, you already understand the shape of the 10 years that followed the unveiling of that drawing. Nothing about the valley changed in that time. The sheep still grazed the course above it. The river still ran the same course it had run since long before anyone thought to bridge it. And the town of Millau still sat below the cliffs with its narrow streets clogging every August as the whole of northern Europe tried to squeeze through it on the way south. The drawing waited in its folder. The valley waited beneath it. And somewhere in between, a decade of doubt did its slow work. The doubt was not irrational, and it deserves to be heard on its own terms rather than dismissed as the noise that always surrounds a great project. Cost was the first and steadiest of the objections, because a structure of that height in that remote a valley, connected to nothing but two ends of a road that did not yet exist in finished form, was going to consume public money on a scale that invited scrutiny from anyone who ever had to justify a budget to a finance ministry. There were officials who asked, reasonably, whether the same relief from summer traffic could be bought more cheaply by widening the old route through the valley floor, or by building something lower, something that hugged the contours instead of leaping clean over them. You can hear the shape of that argument even now if you listen for it in the committee reports that survive from those years. Careful, unglamorous, entirely fair. A government does not owe anyone a bridge in the clouds. It owes its taxpayers the cheapest road that solves the problem. Then there was the matter of the valley's character, which is a harder thing to put a price on and therefore a harder thing to argue about without both sides talking past each other. The Tarn Gorge was, and is, one of the most striking landscapes in that part of France, a place people traveled to see rather than merely pass through. And there were voices, some local and some belonging to national conservation bodies, who asked what right anyone had to plant 7 towers of concrete across a view that had taken the river the better part of 2 million years to carve. You do not have to imagine the tone of those objections, because some of them were written down and survive in the record of the public inquiry that the project was eventually required to undergo. Local associations raised formal reservations about the impact on the gorge and on the town's own relationship with it. Some residents worried, in terms you can still find quoted in the regional press of the period, that Millau would become known only as a place you crossed rather than a place you visited, that the bridge would let the whole of the traffic drift past overhead without ever again touching the streets below. It is worth sitting with that concern for a moment rather than rushing past it, because it turned out, in the way these things often do, to be partly right and partly wrong at once. The traffic did leave the valley floor. The town did not disappear. If anything, it found a strange new fame in the shadow of what was built above it. But no one arguing in the 1990s could have known that in advance, and their caution was not foolishness. It was simply the ordinary weight that any community carries when it is asked to trade a known landscape for an unbuilt promise. The third objection was the quietest, but in some ways the most technical, and it came from engineers rather than residents. Whether a structure that tall, that slender, exposed to wind funneling straight up a gorge that had spent millennia sharpening itself into a wind tunnel could be built at all without becoming something no one would trust to drive across. This was not idle worry. The valley is known for its winds, sharp and sudden, the kind that can rock a high vehicle on the old road even now, and any bridge hung that far above the ground would have to answer to them every single day for the rest of its working life. Rival proposals arrived through the decade precisely because of this doubt, some calling for a lower crossing further downstream where the valley narrowed and the winds might be gentler, others proposing a more conventional structure with more piers, shorter spans, and less of the audacity that had made the original drawing so striking in the first place. You can picture the rooms where these alternatives were laid out side by side, technical men in shirt sleeves arguing quietly over cross-sections, each proposal a little less remarkable than the one before it, each one a little safer to defend in front of a budget committee. It would have been easy in those years for caution to simply win by attrition, for the boldest version of the bridge to be worn down into something ordinary the way water wears down stone, slowly and without anyone striking the final blow. That it did not happen that way is the real story of the decade, and it comes back, as so much of this story does, to a man who has already crossed your path once in this telling. Michel Virlogeux had not been in that valley by accident, and he did not step away from it once the drawing was made. Engineers of his standing are rarely required to spend years defending a design that has already left their drafting table, but that is precisely what the following years demanded of him, session after session, inquiry after inquiry, the same calculations explained again to a new minister, a new committee, a new round of skeptical questions from officials who had not been in the room the first time and needed to be persuaded from nothing. But what does a decade of waiting actually look like from inside it, for the people whose job was not to build anything yet, only to keep the idea alive? It looks mostly like meetings that end without a decision. Virlogeux is on record describing the process not as a single dramatic defense, but as a long accumulation of technical reassurance, study after study, answering the same handful of questions in slightly greater depth each time. What the wind would actually do to a deck that thin, what the piers would actually cost to found in ground, no one had yet drilled deeply enough to be certain of. What a structure like this would actually look like from the town below rather than from the clean white page of a proposal. Public inquiries of the kind France requires for a project of this scale are not swift, and this one ran across years rather than months, gathering objections, commissioning studies, requiring the design team to answer for every assumption in language a non-specialist could follow. If you have ever had to explain your own work, patiently and without impatience, to someone determined not to be impressed by it, you already know something of the discipline that decade demanded. There is no glamour in that kind of defending. It is a quieter, more grinding form of the same conviction that produces a bold drawing in the first place, and it asked more of Virlogeux in its way than the calculations themselves ever had. You do not need to remember any of the committee names or the inquiry dates to feel what this section is really about. And if your attention has already begun to drift with the rhythm of it, that is no failure on your part. This is simply what patience sounds like when it is stretched across years rather than hours. What finally moved the project was not a single triumphant argument, but the same pressure that had started the whole process a decade earlier, arriving again, heavier each summer. The traffic through Millau did not wait for committees, and it did not improve while ministries deliberated. Every August, the queues returned, longer if anything than before, a visible and recurring proof that the problem the bridge had been drawn to solve was not hypothetical. Alternative routes were studied, and one by one found wanting, either too disruptive to the town, too compromised by the terrain, or too far short of the elegance and clearance that the original crossing had promised. Rival designs fell away, not because anyone declared them defeated, but because none of them answered the valley's own geography as completely as the one Virlogeux and his collaborators had proposed at the very start. The government's decision to proceed, when it finally came, arrived less like a verdict and more like an exhaustion of alternatives. The kind of choice a body makes not because every doubt has been silenced, but because the doubts have been weighed for as long as reasonably possible, and the road, quite literally, cannot wait any longer. Contracts were prepared, a construction consortium was engaged to take the design from paper into steel and concrete, and the long argument over whether the bridge should exist at last gave way to the much narrower, much more practical argument over how it would be built. It is a strange feeling if you have ever been part of a project delayed that long, when the waiting simply ends and the working begins, almost without ceremony, as though the years of committee rooms had been a different life entirely. And so, after 10 years spent almost entirely on paper, the valley finally felt the first physical touch of the project that had been argued over above it for so long. Surveyors arrived where until then there had only been sheep tracks and the old road far below, carrying instruments rather than drawings, walking the course on both sides of the gorge to fix the exact points from which 7 towers would eventually rise. They moved carefully, the way anyone moves across ground they do not yet fully trust, taking their sightings, driving their marker stakes, translating a decade of argument into a scatter of small, precise points on the earth. The drawing that had waited so long in its folder was, at last, becoming a set of coordinates. But a coordinate is not a foundation, and the ground beneath those stakes had a great deal it still needed to reveal before anyone could trust it to carry what was coming. The men who came after the surveyors were not engineers at all, not in the way that word is usually meant. They came with drilling rigs mounted on trucks that groaned up tracks better suited to sheep than to machinery, and they came with patience because the valley was not going to tell them anything quickly. If you had stood at the rim of the gorge in those early months, you would have heard it before you saw it. A slow, mechanical knocking, carried strangely by the shape of the land, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. That sound was the valley being asked a question it had never been asked before. Somewhere beneath your feet, a bit was turning through rock that had lain undisturbed since long before there was a name for the river running below it, and the answer it gave back, foot by foot, would decide whether 7 towers could ever stand here at all. You do not build a bridge like this one on faith. You build it on cores of rock pulled up in long grey cylinders, laid out in wooden crates and labelled with a care that borders on reverence, because each one is a sentence in a story no drawing can tell you. The engineers already knew, in a general way, what kind of country they were dealing with. Limestone plateau on either side, softer ground in the river bottom, the whole valley shaped by water working patiently at stone for longer than anyone can easily imagine. But general knowledge does not carry a tower 240 meters into the air. For that, you need to know, at each single point where a pier will stand, exactly what is down there, how deep it lies, how much it can bear before it gives, and how it behaves when it is wet, when it is cold, when it is asked to hold still under a load it has never felt before. So the boreholes went down, one after another, at every point the surveyors had marked with their stakes. If you had walked the line of them, you would have found the work almost dull to watch, men in overalls standing by machinery that did not so much drill as chew, patiently, through meter after meter of the course, while others logged what came up with the unhurried thoroughness of people who understand that a mistake here will not announce itself for years, and when it does, it will announce itself catastrophically. There is no drama to a borehole log. There is only a column of numbers and descriptions, dry as the rock itself, and yet everything that follows depends on someone reading it correctly. What they found, as the results came back through that first long season, was not the tidy, uniform bedrock that a hopeful engineer might have wished for. The valley, it turned out, had opinions of its own, and they varied enormously from one bank to the other. Where the ground rose toward the northern plateau, the rock lay close to the surface, hard and dependable, the kind of foundation an engineer can build on with something close to confidence. Down in the river bottom itself, and along stretches of the southern slope, the story was different. Looser material, weathered limestone, pockets where water had done its slow work over centuries and left something far less trustworthy underneath. A pier planted with total faith on one side of the valley might have found nothing but disappointment had it been planted the same way on the other. It was during this long season of drilling and waiting for results that the foreman became a fixture of the valley in a way he had not quite been before. You may remember him from earlier, standing near the edges of the arguments in Paris and Millau while the decade of doubt dragged on, a man who belonged to the valley rather than to the ministries. But it was here, among the borehole rigs and the crates of core samples, that his part in the story properly began. He had grown up on ground not far from where the towers would eventually stand, knew which farmers owned which slopes, knew which tracks would carry a loaded truck and which would simply swallow one, and it fell to him to gather and steady the local crews who would do the unglamorous work of preparing each site before the real construction ever arrived. He was not an engineer, and he never pretended to be one. But he was the man who made sure the engineer's instructions reached the ground in a form the ground could actually receive, and there is no small skill in that. If a drilling crew needed a track widened before the truck could reach a ridge, he found the men to widen it. If a farmer needed persuading that a survey stake on his land was not the beginning of some larger confiscation, he did the persuading himself, in the valley's own language and on the valley's own terms. There is nothing you need to hold on to from any of this. No names, no numbers, nothing that will be tested later. It is enough to let the picture settle. A valley full of small, patient labor, months before anyone laid a single stone. While somewhere far above, in offices that smelled of drafting ink rather than limestone dust, men studied the columns of numbers coming back from the ground and began, slowly, to understand what kind of bridge the earth itself would allow them to build. But knowing where the 7 towers would stand was only half of the problem the valley had set. What was actually waiting beneath each of those points? And would the answer be the same twice? It would not be, and this is where the story of the foundations stops being simple. You might imagine, reasonably enough, that once an engineer has decided a bridge needs 7 piers, the sensible thing is to design one solid foundation and repeat it 7 times, the way a mason might repeat the same course of brick along an entire wall. That is not what happened here, and it could not have happened, because the ground beneath Pier 1 and the ground beneath Pier 4 were, in the plainest sense, 2 different materials pretending to be part of the same valley. Where the rock came up hard and shallow, close to the northern rim, the engineers could plan a foundation that transferred the enormous weight of a tower almost directly onto bedrock, with comparatively modest excavation and comparatively simple construction beneath it. Where the rock lay deeper, buried under weaker, weathered material down in the river bottom, the same approach would have been reckless. There, the foundations would need to reach further, spread wider, and in places draw on techniques closer to what you would expect beneath a dam than beneath a road. This is the part of any great structure that the finished photograph never shows you, and it is worth lingering on because it is where the real intelligence of the project lived. Each of the 7 piers, in the end, received its own individually calculated foundation, sized and shaped to the particular ground beneath it, rather than to some average condition that existed nowhere in the valley at all. If you had been able to see the design drawings side by side, you would have noticed immediately that no 2 foundations were quite alike. Different depths, different footprints, different arrangements of the concrete and reinforcement below ground, each one an answer tailored to a question the boreholes had already asked and answered on that engineer's behalf. It is a quietly remarkable thing, when you think about it in the dark with nothing else demanding your attention. 7 towers, built to look and behave as a single unified structure, crossing the sky in one continuous rhythm, and yet each one is standing on a foundation that was solved as its own separate problem, because the valley itself refused to offer a single uniform answer. None of this happened quickly, and there is a kind of comfort in that, if you let yourself feel it. The testing stretched across season after season, through summers when the valley baked and the rigs kicked up pale dust that hung in the air long after the trucks had gone quiet, and through winters when the same ground turned hard and uncooperative, and the crews worked in coats against a wind that came down off the course with nothing to slow it. The foreman moved between all of it, valley to plateau and back again, keeping the local labor steady through weather that gave them every reason to want to stop. You do not need to picture the particulars of any single day. It is enough to know that the work went on, patiently, unglamorously, for far longer than anyone watching from outside the valley would have guessed was necessary for a bridge that, from a distance, was still nothing more than a line of stakes across empty air. And slowly, point by point, the picture the engineers had been assembling came into focus. Each of the 7 locations was tested, cross-checked, tested again where the first results left any doubt, and weighed against calculations that had to account not only for the static weight of a finished tower, but for wind loading on a structure that would eventually stand taller than almost anything built by human hands in the country around it. There is no single dramatic moment where the ground was declared sound, no bell rung, no announcement made to a waiting crowd. It happened the way most true engineering happens, in a gradual accumulation of confidence, report after report, confirming what the previous one had suggested, until the doubt that had shadowed the project since its earliest arguments in Paris began quietly to lift. By the time the last of the borehole results were filed and reviewed, the valley had stopped being a question and started becoming a sight. Machinery that had come only to listen began to be joined by machinery that had come to work. Access roads were cut and widened along routes the foreman had already walked 100 times in his head. Compounds were laid out on flat ground that had until recently held nothing but vines and scrub. If your eyes are already closing, that is exactly the right moment to let them, because nothing that follows here needs to be held onto tightly. It is enough to know that the ground had finally given its answer, and the answer, after all that patient asking, was yes. What waited next was the part the valley had been quietly delaying all along. The digging of the foundations themselves, deep into rock and softer ground alike, and the first true test of everything the boreholes had promised. You would have felt the digging before you saw it, if you had been standing anywhere near the valley floor in those first weeks. A low tremor coming up through your boots, steady as a heartbeat, long before the machines themselves came into view around the shoulder of the hill. 8 sites, one for each pier, and at every one of them the same patient violence. Excavators working down through the topsoil, then the harder ground beneath it, opening pits wide enough to swallow a house and deep enough that the workers standing at the bottom of them would have looked, from where you stood at the rim, like children. This was not dramatic work, not the kind that photographs well or draws a crowd, and if your mind is already drifting loose from the details, that is no loss at all. The digging itself asked for nothing but time and care, the same 2 things that had gone into the boreholes before it, only now multiplied across a valley instead of concentrated in a single testing rig. Each pit was cut down to the rock or the dense, load-bearing ground the engineers had already found and mapped, and each one was shored and drained and inspected before anyone would allow the next stage to begin. You do not rush a hole you are about to build a mountain on top of. Once a pit was ready, the reinforcement went in, cages of steel bar bent and tied by hand into shapes that mirrored in miniature the loads the finished pier would one day carry. Picture a bird cage built for something enormous, its bars as thick as your wrist, welded and wired into a lattice that a crane would lower into the pit hole, swinging gently on its cables while the riggers below guided it into position with nothing more than shouted instructions and raised hands. Get that alignment wrong by even a small amount at this depth, buried under everything that follows, and there would be no going back to correct it, a fact that sat quietly behind every one of those slow, careful lowerings. Then came the concrete, and here is where the sheer scale of the thing starts to become difficult to hold in your head all at once, which is perhaps exactly as it should be at this hour. Each foundation took not a single pour but many, poured in stages so the mass of curing concrete would not crack itself apart with its own trapped heat. A detail that surprises people every time I tell it because it sounds almost gentle, a structure being protected from itself. The concrete came by truck, along roads that had never been built to carry this kind of traffic, winding down from the plateau in a nearly continuous procession through the working months, one lorry arriving roughly every few minutes at the height of it. If you had stood at the valley's rim and watched that line of trucks descending, dust rising behind each one, you might have mistaken it for a small, slow-moving army, which, in its way, it was. The logistics of simply getting material into this valley deserve a moment of their own, because the Tarn had not made things easy for anyone hoping to build here. There were no rail lines down at the valley floor, no barge traffic on a river too shallow and too fast for that kind of work, nothing but the roads themselves, narrow, switching roads that had served vineyards and small farms for generations and now had to serve a construction site consuming raw material by the truckload. Local quarries supplied much of the aggregate. Cement arrived from further afield, timed carefully so that pours were never delayed waiting on a delivery, because concrete does not wait patiently once it has begun to set. Someone, somewhere in an office up on the plateau, was solving a puzzle of trucks and schedules and weather forecasts that never once appears in the photographs of the finished bridge, and yet without it, none of what follows would have been possible at all. And underneath all of that logistics sat the question that mattered more than any of it: precision. This is the part I find myself returning to whenever I think about this stage of the work, because it is so easy to miss, and so easy, once you see it, to never stop noticing. A pier base, set even a small fraction of a degree out of true, would not stay a small error. It would grow, quietly, invisibly, as the pier climbed, the same way a single degree of drift on a long walk can carry you a surprising distance from where you meant to end up. At the eventual height these piers were reaching for, taller than almost anything else standing in the region, an error too small to see with the naked eye at the base could become a lien of real, measurable consequence at the top. So the surveyors were out at every one of those 8 pits again and again, checking and rechecking with instruments more patient than any human eye, before a single cage was lowered and before a single truck was allowed to pour. But how do you keep 8 of these operations moving at once, in a valley with one road down into it and one road out, without the whole thing collapsing into chaos? That question belonged more than to anyone else to the foreman, the same steady figure who had walked the boreholes with the engineers in the seasons before, watching the ground give up its answers one core sample at a time. Now the ground had answered, and the answer had turned into 8 simultaneous excavations, 8 concrete schedules, 8 crews each with their own rhythm, and somehow all of it had to move together, or at least move without tripping over itself. You will not find this person's name in the archives because no record was kept of one foreman among many on a project this size, and I think that omission is worth sitting with for a moment rather than rushing past an entire working life spent solving problems that made everything else possible, remembered by no one in particular, and yet utterly essential to what rose from this valley. The foreman's days, by every account of how sites like this actually ran, would have started before the light did. Walking from pit to pit with a clipboard and a memory better than the clipboard, checking which crew was pouring, which was still shoring, which was waiting on a delivery that had not yet come down from the plateau. There is nothing dramatic in that description, and there does not need to be. It is simply the quiet arithmetic that keeps 8 enormous holes in the ground from becoming 8 separate disasters. If a truck was late at pit 4, a crew might be shifted temporarily to pit 6, where the reinforcement cage was finally ready to be lowered. If rain threatened, and this valley could turn from clear sky to hard rain with very little warning, pours had to be timed around it, because water in curing concrete is no friend to strength. Multiply that kind of decision by 8 sites, and by every working day across the length of this stage, and you begin to understand why a competent foreman was worth as much to this project as any engineer with a design on paper. The paper does not argue with the weather. The foreman did, every single morning. It is worth pausing here gently to let this whole picture settle rather than pressing forward too quickly. The trucks, the cages, the surveyors with their instruments, the foreman moving between pits in the grey hour before dawn. None of it needs to be remembered in detail. What matters is only the shape of it. Patience applied at enormous scale, care taken with something that would soon be buried and never seen again, and a valley slowly filling with the first true evidence that something permanent was being made here, because that is what began to happen, pit by pit, as the weeks wore on. One by one, the 8 foundations were completed, the last pours finished, the formwork stripped away, the great grey masses left to cure fully in the open air before anything more would be asked of them. For the first time since the surveys had begun, someone standing at the rim of the valley could look down and see unmistakably the beginnings of a plan rather than a landscape being worked. 8 pale shapes sat along the valley floor and partway up its slopes, spaced with a regularity that no natural feature would ever have produced on its own, evenly set as if a hand far larger than any human one had pressed its fingertips into the ground and left them there to set. You would not yet have called it a bridge, standing there. There was no height to it yet, nothing reaching up toward the plateau on either side, nothing to suggest the scale that was still to come. But something had changed in the valley all the same, something the vineyards and scrub had never known in all the centuries before the surveyors first arrived with their drills. The ground had stopped being simply ground. It had become, at 8 careful points, the beginning of something else entirely. And it was only from these quiet, patient foundations, buried and unglamorous as they were, that the piers themselves would soon begin their long climb into the sky above the Tarn. Before that climb could begin, though, there was a quieter interval that rarely makes it into any account of the bridge at all, the curing itself, the waiting that concrete demands and will not be talked out of. 4 full weeks, in some cases longer, before engineers would trust a foundation to bear real weight upon it, and through all of that time the site did not rest so much as shift its attention elsewhere. Cranes that would later serve the piers were being assembled on the plateau above. Formwork panels, stripped from one pit, were cleaned and inspected and readied to be lowered into position for the base of the pier itself, the first course of what would eventually stand taller than almost any other bridge support on the continent. You could have walked the rim of the valley in those weeks and found it strangely quiet in places, the frantic traffic of trucks thinned to almost nothing, the 8 pale foundations simply sitting there under the sun and the occasional hard rain, hardening by degrees no eye could track. If you are half asleep already, let that stillness carry you a moment. There is nothing urgent happening here, only stone-hard patience doing its slow work in silence. But patience has its limits on a project like this one, and the moment each foundation passed its final strength tests, the site woke again. Formwork rose from the pit floor in narrow rectangular collars, the first hint of a pier's true shape beginning to show itself above ground for the first time. And it was here, at this exact threshold between buried foundation and visible structure, that the true climb toward the sky was about to begin. Stone was the material this valley already trusted. Look at the old bridges further down the Tarn, the cottages built into the hillsides, the retaining walls along the roads that wind down into Millau itself, all of it limestone, all of it quarried close to where it stands. The way bridges had been built here for centuries. If you had asked anyone in the town what a new crossing over the gorge ought to be made from, most would have said stone without a second thought, because stone was what had always held this country together. But the piers you have already watched rise from their pits are concrete, not cut stone, and above them, still waiting at facilities hundreds of kilometers away, sits a deck that is not concrete at all, but steel. That choice, made years before a single pier reached its full height, is worth pausing over, because it tells you almost everything about the kind of bridge this was meant to be. Concrete for the piers made sense the moment you understood what those piers would be asked to do. They needed compressive strength above almost anything else, the simple, patient ability to carry enormous weight straight down into the ground without complaint, and concrete, poured and cured in place, gives you that in abundance, along with a mass that helps steady a structure standing so exposed to wind. But a deck is a different animal entirely. A deck does not simply sit and bear weight the way a pier does. It flexes, it breathes, it moves under traffic and temperature, and the enormous restless pressure of wind moving through a gorge shaped like a funnel. Had they built that deck from concrete too, the whole structure would have grown heavier at exactly the point where weight was least welcome, high above the valley floor, far from the ground that alone could forgive it. Michel Virlogeux understood this arithmetic long before groundbreaking, and it sat at the very center of his design. Every additional ton in the deck did not simply add to the load on the piers beneath it, it multiplied the demands on foundations already working near the edge of what this valley's geology could tolerate, on piers already asked to stand taller than almost anything built for a road anywhere on Earth. Steel, by comparison, offered strength without nearly the same weight, a skeleton that could span the enormous distances between piers while remaining light enough not to punish the very structure holding it up. You do not need to hold the mathematics of it in your mind to feel the logic. You only need to picture 2 ropes strung between the same posts, one thick and heavy, one lighter and taut, and understand instinctively which one asks less of the posts holding it. There was also the matter of wind, and here the reasoning turns almost tactile. A gorge like the Tarn does not merely allow wind to pass through it, it accelerates it, funnels it, sends gusts along its length that a bridge exposed at such height would feel far more violently than anything built closer to the ground. A solid concrete deck, dense and heavy, would have presented an unbroken wall to that wind, catching it the way a ship's hull catches a wave rather than letting it pass. The steel deck, aerodynamically shaped and comparatively slender, was designed instead to let the wind slide around and beneath it, to breathe with the gusts rather than fight them outright. If you have ever stood on a headland in a strong wind and felt the difference between bracing your whole body against it and simply turning slightly to let it pass you by, you already understand in your own bones the same instinct Virlogeux built into steel. None of this made the decision effortless, and there is nothing here that needs to press on you as you listen. The calculations behind it took years, refined and re-refined long before the first pier pit was ever dug. And if your eyes are already closing, let all of that patient arithmetic simply exist somewhere behind you, unattended to, the way it existed for the engineers themselves during the long nights when the numbers alone were the only company they had. What mattered in the end was a structure balanced between two materials, rather than surrendered entirely to one. Concrete below, planted and immovable, steel above, light and yielding, each doing only the work it was suited to. But choosing steel was only half the puzzle. Deciding a bridge deck ought to be built from steel does not answer the much harder question of how you actually get enough of it, in the right shape, to a valley this remote, and assemble it into something capable of stretching across such a distance without ever touching the ground beneath. That question, where does steel like this come from, and how does it travel, turns out to be its own story, every bit as demanding as the concrete work you have already followed into the ground. The steel for the Millau deck was never going to be forged anywhere near the valley itself, and there was never any expectation that it would be. Instead, the deck was conceived from the very beginning as something built elsewhere, in pieces, and brought to the gorge only once each piece was ready to take its place. Fabrication was carried out at facilities scattered across France, among them yards near Fos-sur-Mer on the Mediterranean coast, where the steel was cut, shaped and welded into deck segments long before any of it saw the Tarn. You can picture those yards as something closer to shipbuilding than road building, vast covered sheds ringing with the sound of welding torches and grinding wheels, cranes swinging steel plate through the air the way they might swing the plates of a hull, the whole operation smelling of hot metal and cutting oil rather than wet cement and river silt. It would have felt, standing in one of those sheds, almost nothing like standing at the valley's edge, and yet everything happening there was being made for that one specific place, cut and welded to tolerances measured for a gorge most of the workers there had likely never seen. Each segment of deck was built as what engineers call an orthotropic box, a hollow steel structure stiffened from within by a lattice of ribs and diaphragms, strong for its weight in a way that solid steel plate alone could never manage. If you have ever picked up a cardboard box built with internal folds and been surprised at how much it could hold without buckling, you already have some feel for the principle, though here the folds were welded steel rather than creased paper, and the loads they were built to carry were measured in tons of traffic rather than tons of nothing at all. Building the deck this way kept it light enough to satisfy Virlogeux's arithmetic, while still giving it the rigidity to resist twisting under wind or the uneven weight of vehicles crossing it. Once fabricated, each segment had to travel. And this too was no small feat, though it unfolded far from the drama of the valley itself, along roads and rail lines that most of the traveling public would never think twice about. Convoys carried the great steel sections across the country in stages, moving at the slow, careful pace such loads demand, closing lanes, requiring escorts, threading through towns whose streets had never been built with cargo like this in mind. If you had been standing on a roadside in one of those towns as a convoy passed, you would have felt the ground itself carry a faint tremor before you ever saw the trucks, and then watched a shape too large for the street slide past for what would have felt like an unreasonably long time, dwarfing the houses and shop fronts on either side of it. None of this appeared in any photograph of the finished bridge, and yet without it there would have been nothing to lift into place above the gorge at all. The genius of the design lay not simply in choosing steel, but in choosing to build the deck this way, off-site, in manageable, repeatable segments, rather than attempting to construct anything of this scale in the air above the valley itself. Every segment could be checked, tested, and refined on solid ground, under cover, free from wind and height, and the particular hazards of working so far above a riverbed. And because each segment was essentially identical in method, if not always in exact dimension, the fabrication yards could work in a kind of rhythm, one section following another down a production line the way a modern factory might produce anything at all if that anything happened to weigh as much as a small building. It meant that by the time steel began arriving near the valley's edge, the most technically delicate part of its manufacture was already behind it, tested and proven long before it ever had to bear real weight above real air. That arrival, when it finally came, changed the character of the site once again. Where for so long the valley had belonged to concrete, to pores and curing chambers and the patient chemistry of a foundation setting in darkness, now flatbed trailers began appearing at the valley's edge, carrying steel sections too large to look real against the landscape around them, shapes that seemed built for some other larger world and only borrowed for this one. You do not need to remember the exact sequence of it, only the picture. Pale limestone hills, a river far below, and now, laid along the approach roads, dark steel segments waiting their turn, each one eventually destined to be lifted, launched, and joined high above the ground that had taken years simply to be trusted to hold anything at all. For now, though, the piers remained the visible heart of the work, climbing steadily skyward while the steel waited nearby almost patiently, as if it understood its turn had not yet come. Cranes still swung concrete rather than steel. Formwork still rose in its slow, rectangular collars, and the site still moved to the unhurried rhythm it had kept since the first foundation was poured. But something had shifted all the same. Some sense that the valley was no longer simply digging and pouring and waiting, but gathering. Steel arriving in one direction, concrete rising in another. The two halves of Virlogeux's balanced arithmetic finally beginning to occupy the same stretch of ground at the same time, each one drawing closer to the moment when they would finally have to meet. Up close, a pier under construction does not look like the thing it will become. It looks like a construction site standing on its end, a squat concrete collar wrapped in steel formwork, a tangle of hydraulic rams and walkways bolted to its outer face, and above it, almost lost against the sky, a crane whose jib seems too small for the work it is doing. If you stood at the base of one of these piers in the early months of the climb, you would have had to tip your head back until your neck ached just to find the top of it, and even then, the crane driver's cab would have loomed like a speck of grit against the clouds. There is nothing dramatic in how a pier like this rises. It happens by inches, by lifts, by patient repetitions of the same sequence performed so many times that the men doing it stop thinking of it as remarkable at all. The method itself is called climbing formwork, and it is worth sitting with for a moment because it explains almost everything about how a concrete tower this tall can be built without ever needing scaffolding that reaches from the ground to the summit. A steel mold shaped to the curve of the pier's cross-section is fixed around the top of what has already been poured. Concrete is pumped into the gap between that mold and the reinforcing cage inside it, left to cure for a matter of days, and then the mold itself is unbolted, lifted by hydraulic rams bolted to the hardened concrete below it, and set down again a few meters higher, ready to receive the next pour. The pier, in other words, builds its own scaffold as it goes, climbing on top of what it has already made. You could stand and watch an entire lift happen and see almost nothing move. A slow, creeping adjustment of steel against concrete, the rams sighing under hydraulic pressure. The whole apparatus inching upward like something being pulled on a very long, very patient string. Each lift like this measured only a handful of meters, and each one took the better part of a week to prepare, pour, and cure properly before the formwork could rise again. Which meant that a pier's climb toward the sky was not counted in days at all, but in months, sometimes stretching across the better part of a year for a single pier to reach its full height. There is something almost meditative in that pace if you let yourself sit inside it rather than rushing past it. No single day looked like progress. It was only when you set one photograph beside another taken months apart that the valley seemed to have changed at all. If your eyes are already closing, that patience is exactly the right frame to carry with you. Nothing here needed to happen quickly, and nothing here did. The scaffolds and gantries that clung to the outside of each pier as it rose were their own quiet feat of engineering, separate from the concrete itself. They had to grip a surface that, in its lower sections, had not yet fully cured, concrete that was hard enough to bear weight, but still, in an engineering sense, young, still finishing its slow chemical transformation from liquid to stone. Every anchor bolted into that surface had to be sized and placed with an understanding of exactly how much strength the concrete had already gained and how much more it would gain in the days ahead, because a bolt trusted too early could tear loose, and a platform built on an assumption that proved wrong would simply not be there anymore. You would have heard this consideration talked about constantly on site in the flat technical language of concrete curves and strength gains, but underneath the language was a fairly simple idea. Nothing here was ever asked to hold more than it had actually, provably, become capable of holding. Cranes did their own version of the same climb. Rather than a single tower crane reaching impossibly high from the valley floor, each pier carried its own crane that rose with it, anchored to the concrete at intervals and extended section by section as the pier itself grew taller. Climbing cranes, in effect, keeping pace with climbing formwork, two separate machines rising together up the same shrinking column of air. From where you would have stood on the valley floor, looking up at one of these assemblies against a pale morning sky, it would have been hard to say where the permanent structure ended and the temporary one began. Steel and concrete braided together, rising in tandem, each depending entirely on the other to keep climbing at all. But what does it actually feel like to be the person standing on that platform day after day as the ground beneath you slips further and further out of reach? That question sat differently with different people on the site, and the answer changed as the piers themselves grew. In the early lifts, when a worker stood only 20 or 30 meters above the valley floor, the height was still recognizably human, comparable to a tall building, the kind of elevation most construction workers in France had stood at before, on cranes or scaffolds elsewhere in their careers. But the piers of this bridge were not built to stop at a height any construction worker would call ordinary. As the lifts accumulated month after month, the piers climbed past the point where the valley floor still looked like a place you could imagine walking back down to in a hurry, and into a register of height that had almost no precedent in French construction at all. Taller in places than famous towers built specifically to be looked at from below. Structures whose entire purpose was to advertise their own height, now quietly overtaken by a bridge pier built for no reason except to hold a road in the air. At that height, the wind behaves differently than it does closer to the ground, and everyone on site learned this the practical way rather than the theoretical one. It does not simply blow harder. It becomes less predictable, arriving in gusts that seem to come from nowhere and vanish just as suddenly, plucking at loose material and testing every fastening on the platforms with a kind of patient, repeated insistence. Work was stopped on the higher lifts whenever the wind crossed certain thresholds, and there is a particular kind of waiting that develops among men on a platform who can feel a gust building before the anemometer confirms it. A stillness, a bracing, a shared instinct that needed no instruction to obey. If you had been standing among them, you would have felt that same stillness settle into your own body before you understood quite why. The psychological weight of the height mattered as much as the physical demands, and the site's safety measures grew heavier as the piers grew taller, almost as if the two climbed together. Harnesses that had been optional lower down became mandatory at every level once the piers passed the height where a fall stopped being merely dangerous and became, in the flat language the safety officers used, unsurvivable regardless of what caught you. Netting was strung at intervals up the height of each pier, not to make a fall pleasant but to shorten it. Rest breaks were scheduled more deliberately for crews working the top lifts, not because the physical labor there was harder than anywhere else on site, but because sustained attention at that height carries its own kind of fatigue. One that has nothing to do with muscle and everything to do with the mind's slow tiring under the strain of vigilance. You do not have to hold any of this too tightly. It is enough to know that the men who built this were watched over deliberately and continuously by people whose entire job was making sure the height never became more than the structure or the workers could bear. It was the foreman, the same one who had walked the site through its earliest months of surveying and foundation work, who now found himself managing crews at elevations that would have been unthinkable to him at the start of his career. He had come up through work that rarely put a man more than a few stories above solid ground. And here he was, checking harness clips and lift schedules at a height where the crane cabs below him had shrunk to the size of a matchbox. One story recorded from the site during this period describes him climbing to the top platform of a nearly finished pier specifically to eat his lunch there, alone, on a still morning when the wind had dropped, not out of any particular occasion, but simply as those who worked with him remembered it, because he wanted to know what it felt like before he asked anyone else to spend their whole shift there. It is a small thing, barely a footnote in the larger record of the build, but it says something about the kind of care that ran quietly underneath all the harnesses and netting and stopped work thresholds. A foreman who would not ask a height of his crews that he had not first stood in himself. By the time the piers neared their full height, that height had become almost impossible to hold in the mind as a single fact. Numbers were repeated on site the way numbers often are in the middle of a long job, half remembered, occasionally argued over, never quite as vivid as simply standing at the base and looking up until your neck complained. What mattered more than any figure was the shape the valley had taken on. 7 concrete columns, each one now taller than almost anything else built by human hands in the country, standing in a line across the gorge like the piers of some structure whose deck had not yet arrived to explain them. They were not finished. Each one still carried at its summit the climbing formwork that had carried it there, patient and unbolted, waiting for one final lift that would not be concrete at all, but steel. The masts that would crown each pier and give the cables, still coiled somewhere far below, something to rise toward. The piers had done their long, unhurried work of climbing. What waited above them now was a different kind of ascent altogether. That final lift would not come for some months yet, and in the meantime, the formwork simply sat there, capped and quiet, like a nest waiting for something else to hatch from it. Down on the valley floor, a different kind of work had already begun, steel arriving by the truckload, cut and drilled to shapes that meant nothing on their own, but everything once you saw where they were meant to go. You would have noticed the shift in sound first, long before you understood what it meant. Less pouring now, more grinding, more the clang of metal finding metal. The steel did not announce itself the way the concrete had. There had been something almost ceremonial about a pour, the trucks queued, the chute swinging, 40 men watching a single seam fill by inches. Steel arrived like ordinary freight, flatbeds groaning down roads never built for that kind of weight, and it was only when you saw where the pieces were being carried, up, always up, toward men who had spent the better part of a year learning to live at height, that you understood something had changed in the character of the work itself. The valley was no longer only a place where a bridge was being made. It had become, for several hundred people, simply where they lived their days, and it is that daily rhythm, more than any single technical feat, that the record remembers most fondly when it remembers this site at all. You would have started most mornings in the dark. The camp that had grown up near Millau held workers from across the country and beyond it, drawn by wages that were good by regional standards, though never extravagant, and by the plain fact that a project of this size needed hands faster than the local trades could supply them. A crew bus left before first light, and if you had been aboard one of those buses, you would have felt the whole vehicle tilt and sway as it climbed the access road, headlights catching mist low in the trees. Nobody talking much, most men with their eyes half shut against a day that had not yet decided how it would treat them. Shift patterns rotated according to which part of the works needed attention, Foundation crews kept different hours from the pier gangs, and later the deck launching teams worked to a rhythm dictated less by the clock than by the engineers, who preferred to move the great steel span during the cooler, stiller hours when wind and temperature both behaved themselves. There is nothing you need to hold on to here, no schedule to memorize, only the sense of a place that never entirely slept, lit at odd hours by work lamps on a pier top, a small constellation hanging where no light should have been. The canteen sat low against the hillside, a temporary building that nonetheless became, by every surviving account, the true center of the site. More so, some said, than the site offices where the engineers pored over drawings. You would have smelled it before you reached the door, coffee and bread, and the particular warmth of a kitchen working to feed several hundred appetites on a schedule that could not slip. Meals were simple and generous, the kind of food meant to put weight back into men who had spent a shift fighting wind and their own vertigo. And there was a rough camaraderie in the room that crossed the usual divisions of trade. Riggers sitting with concrete finishers, welders next to surveyors, all of them united by the plane, shared knowledge of what the job asked of a person. Wages, by the accounts that survive, were considered fair rather than remarkable, and it was said more than once among the crews that the money was not really what kept a man coming back up that access road each morning. It was something closer to pride, the sense of being present for something that would still be standing long after the paycheck was spent. That pride sat alongside a very particular kind of fear, and it is worth pausing on that fear honestly, because no account of this build is complete without it. The piers by this point stood taller than almost anything else for miles, and the platforms where men worked hung far enough above the valley floor that the fields below looked like a child's model, the river a thread, the cattle smaller than insects. You do not get used to that distance quickly, whatever the veterans might tell a newcomer on his first week. Wind at that height behaved differently than it did on the ground. It arrived without warning, it gusted where the valley funneled it strangely between the hills, and every crew that worked the high platforms learned to read it the way a sailor reads weather, feeling a change in the air on their skin before any instrument confirmed it. The psychological toll of that exposure was real and openly discussed among the workforce, and the site's safety culture grew directly out of it rather than out of any abstract policy handed down from an office. Harnesses were checked and rechecked. Certain platforms were closed the moment wind speeds crossed an agreed threshold, no argument permitted, the decision taken out of any individual's hands so that no one felt pressure to prove themselves against the weather. It was a lesson written, as so many safety lessons are, in the memory of near misses rather than any single document, and it held. But what was it actually like to spend a working day out there, hundreds of feet above a valley that did not care whether you kept your footing? That question sat with everyone on site, spoken or not, and the answers the workforce arrived at over months of practice are as much a part of this bridge's story as the steel itself. You would have eaten your midday meal on some of those platforms without ever coming down. It was not always practical to descend and climb back up again within the time allowed, so food was carried up in bags and eaten sitting on a plank walkway with your legs stretched out and the valley falling away beneath your boots. The kind of view that either settles a person or unsettles them completely, and by every account it settled far more than it unsettled, because the ones it truly frightened generally did not last on the crew. There were, as there always are on high work, small superstitions that passed quietly between riggers, a particular boot laced a particular way, a refusal to whistle on the platform, the sense, only half joked about, that the wind noticed carelessness and answered it. None of this made its way into any official log, and none of it needs to be taken as more than what it was. The ordinary human habit of making a dangerous place feel a little more governable by ritual. The foreman on the pier crews, one face among many, the record kept no name for, representative of a role every great structure has needed and rarely credited, was remembered by those who worked under him for a routine that had nothing to do with concrete or steel at all. Before the light went, he walked the platforms himself, checking harness lines, checking that tools were stowed and would not become falling hazards in the night wind, checking each man's face for the particular tiredness that meant he should not come back the next morning without rest. It was a small thing, repeated without variation, and it is exactly the kind of detail that never appears in an engineering report and yet did more, probably, than any single safety regulation to keep that crew whole across the length of the build. If your eyes have already grown heavy, let that image rest with you a moment. A man walking a narrow platform in fading light, checking on people, before the valley goes properly dark. It was into this rhythm, rather than only into the finished drawings, that Norman Foster occasionally stepped. His visits to the site were not frequent. The architect's role by this stage of the build was largely done, the great decisions of form already settled years before the first pier rose, but when he did come, those present remembered him paying attention to details that had little to do with structural performance. He was said to walk the completed sections of deck, asking not how much load they carried, but how they would feel to a driver crossing at speed, whether the parapet line drew the eye forward smoothly or interrupted it, whether the piers, seen from a moving car, would seem to rise and fall in a rhythm pleasing to someone who had never thought about engineering in their life and never would. It was a reminder on a site otherwise governed by tolerances and load calculations that somewhere beneath all the steel and scheduling sat an idea about what it should feel like to be an ordinary traveler passing through, unaware of any of this, simply glad the road kept going. You are, in a sense, that traveler now, listening from a distance of years and a great many miles, and it is worth remembering that someone on this site was thinking of you, or someone like you, even then. What the site built in the end, alongside its piers and its steel, was something less easily measured, a community that existed for a fixed span of time, bound to a single purpose and aware, in its own quiet way, that it would not last. Crews who had never met before the project began found themselves, months in, arranging their evenings around each other's company, trading stories from other jobs, other countries, other bridges that had not gone half so well. There was an unspoken understanding that this posting was unusual, that few would work on anything quite like it again, and that understanding gave the ordinary business of shift changes and canteen meals a weight it might not have carried elsewhere. It is that fragile, temporary togetherness, formed under wind and altitude and the plain fact of shared risk, that the engineers would lean on hardest in the months ahead, when the true climax of the build arrived and the deck itself, already taking shape below, would have to be pushed out across open air toward piers that, for now, still stood waiting, alone against the sky. There was a particular week, remembered by several of the older hands, when the weather turned against the whole schedule at once, and the site did nothing for 4 straight days, but wait. Wind gauges on the tallest pier held steady above the threshold that closed the platforms, and the crew bus still climbed the access road each morning out of habit as much as necessity, delivering men to a site where there was, for the moment, almost nothing safe to do. You would have found them in the canteen longer than usual those mornings, cards dealt across a table meant for eating, the radio on low, everyone half listening for a change in the gauge readings that would send them back up. It cost the schedule real time, though nobody on site treated the delay as failure. The wind, like the ground before it, was simply another condition to be waited out rather than argued with, and the engineers had built enough slack into their plans to absorb a few lost days without panic. What could not be absorbed so easily was the deck itself, already assembling on the plateau above the valley in sections too heavy and too long to be carried up the way the pier steel had come, waiting for a method that had never quite been attempted at this scale, and it was toward that problem, once the wind finally dropped, that the whole rhythm of the site began quietly to turn. The deck did not rise from below the way the piers had. It grew instead on the flat ground at either end of the valley, on 2 long assembly yards laid out like runways above the void, one on the Kos to the north and one on the plateau to the south. And if you had walked those yards in the early stages, you would have found them almost peaceful. Steel plate laid out in the open air, welders bent low over seams, the whole structure of the future bridge lying flat and patient before it ever left the ground. It looked from a distance less like the beginning of a bridge and more like a shipyard that had wandered inland. hulls of steel taking shape in sections before anyone asked them to float. That comparison would have pleased the people building it, because what came next was, in its way, a kind of launching. The method is called incremental launching, and it is a quiet, almost stubborn idea. Rather than lifting finished spans into place with cranes too large to exist, or building the deck outward on falsework rising from a valley floor that here offered no falsework at all, the engineers chose to assemble the deck behind the piers, in short sections welded one to the next, and then push the whole growing length forward, a little at a time, out over the gap. Each new section added weight to the tail end, and hydraulic jacks at the back did the pushing, gripping the steel and shoving it forward in strokes you could measure with your own forearm, then releasing and gripping again, over and over, so that the deck crept outward the way a tongue of ice creeps down a mountain, not dramatically, but with a patience that never quite stopped. You would have felt it more than seen it if you had stood close enough and put a hand flat on the steel. Not a shudder, just a faint, continuous pressure, like something breathing very slowly. What made this launch different from anything attempted before was simply the scale of the emptiness it crossed. Bridges had been launched this way, over rivers, over roads, over modest gaps, where a temporary support here and there cost little and risked less. Here the deck had to travel out from the plateau and hang at moments over open air higher than anything nearby, advancing toward piers so far apart that the unsupported length in between, the overhang engineers call it, grew longer than most bridges in their entirety before it ever touched anything solid again. Every meter added to that overhang added weight to a lever arm with nothing beneath it, and every calculation Virlogeux had made years earlier, back when the whole design still lived on paper, now had to hold true in steel, in wind, in the particular heat of an Aveyron afternoon that made metal expand by fractions no drawing could quite anticipate. To keep that reaching arm from drooping under its own weight, the crews fitted the leading edge of the deck with a long steel launching nose, a lighter, lattice-like extension that stretched out ahead of the true deck like the beak of some enormous bird, taking the worst of the unsupported bending before the heavier structure arrived to replace it. And where the span could not yet reach a permanent pier, temporary steel towers were driven down into the valley to catch it part way, slender scaffolds of their own, holding a resting point in the middle of nothing until the deck had grown strong enough and long enough to no longer need them. You would have looked up from certain angles on the valley floor and seen a line of impossibly thin towers holding up what looked like a horizon that had simply decided to project itself outward into space. None of this happened quickly, and none of it was meant to. The advance was measured in centimeters an hour, sometimes less, the jacks working through the cooler parts of the day, pausing when the steel grew too warm and swelled unpredictably, resuming at dusk when it began, slowly, to settle back into its true dimensions. If you had stood on the plateau and tried to watch the deck move, you would have seen nothing at all, no shift, no motion, nothing you could point to and say, there, it moved. Only if you looked away and returned an hour later, would you notice the gap had changed. The shadow beneath the leading edge had shortened, the whole vast structure a little nearer to something it had not yet reached. It is a strange kind of drama, one built entirely out of accumulation rather than event, and if your eyes are already growing heavy, that is exactly the right way to receive it. Nothing here demands your attention all at once, only your patience, the same patience the site itself was built on. But precision at this scale is not simply a matter of pushing steel forward and hoping it lands where it should. What does it actually take to keep something so vast pointed true, unsupported, drifting out over such a drop, without ever wandering left or right, without ever tipping down toward the river so far below it? The answer lay partly in the jacks themselves, which did not simply shove blindly, but worked in careful matched pairs, synchronized so that neither side of the deck advanced faster than the other, because even a slight mismatch, sustained over the length of a launch, could twist the whole structure out of true by an amount no eye could correct once it had set into the steel. And it lay partly in a small army of guidance systems bolted along the piers themselves, sliding bearings faced with a slick, low-friction material that let the deck glide across the tops of the piers the way a heavy trunk might be eased across a polished floor. each pier fitted with sensors and stops that told the crews, continuously, whether the deck was drifting even slightly off its intended line. Surveyors stood at fixed points along the valley, with instruments trained on the advancing edge, calling back tiny corrections, fractions of a degree, fractions of a centimetre, the kind of number that means nothing to hold in your head and everything to the steel it is measuring. It was Virlogeux's arithmetic, worked out long before any of this steel existed, that had told them exactly how far the deck could reach before the temporary towers were needed, exactly how much camber to build into each section, so that the sagging predicted by the calculations would settle, once the span finally found its permanent supports, into the gentle, level line the eye would eventually read as a bridge crossing a valley rather than curving through it. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over engineers watching a design prove itself correct in real time. Not celebration, nothing so loud as that. But something closer to relief held very still, the sense of a bet placed years earlier finally coming due. You could have stood beside one of them at the guidance station, watching numbers on a readout drift within the tolerances the paperwork had promised, and seen very little in his face beyond a kind of settled attention, as if he had expected this all along and simply wanted to see it confirmed. The foreman who had once walked the course checking anchor bolts by lamplight, one of the many whose names the records never kept, but whose kind is on every site like this one, found himself now walking the launching yard instead, checking weld seams before they disappeared under the next section, checking that the jacks gripped clean, that nothing in the enormous, patient machine had been left to chance simply because the process itself moved so slowly. The work had not gotten easier as the bridge climbed higher. If anything, the exposure had grown, the height beneath the advancing deck now several times what it had been when the piers themselves were still rising. But the rhythm had become almost meditative, shift after shift, jack stroke after jack stroke, the whole valley humming faintly with a labor too gradual to startle anyone, too enormous to ever quite finish in a single day. From the two ends of the valley, north and south, the decks kept advancing toward each other through that long, unhurried spring, each one growing by its careful centimeters, each one passing over one more temporary tower, one more permanent pier, the gap between them narrowing in a way that no single day's work made obvious, but that a month's worth made undeniable. You did not need to watch closely to sense it, only to return the way you might return to a garden and notice, without having seen it happen, that everything in it had grown. Down in the valley itself, farmers going about their ordinary business beneath all that suspended steel had by now grown used to the sight, glancing upward out of habit rather than alarm, the way you might glance at weather rather than at a wonder. And still the piers waited, the two unfinished gaps standing open above the river like a sentence missing its final word, the northern deck and the southern deck each reaching now toward a middle. Neither had yet touched, each one carrying, somewhere in its advancing structure, the exact calculations that promised they would meet not by luck but by design. There is no need to hold any of these numbers in your mind tonight, only the shape of the thing, two vast steel tongues easing toward each other through the sky above a river, drawing closer with every quiet incremental hour, the valley beneath them growing narrower not because the land had changed, but because the distance across it was, at last, running out. There was, in those final weeks of the approach, a change you could have felt even without knowing the numbers behind it. The surveyors at their instruments began calling corrections more often, not because the deck had grown less steady, but because the margin for error had shrunk to almost nothing. The two advancing edges now close enough that a fraction of a degree carried a different weight than it had a month before. The foreman found himself crossing between the two guidance stations more than once a shift, comparing readings north and south, as if the valley itself had narrowed his own route along with the gap above it. Radios that had once carried lazy occasional updates now carried a steadier traffic, short exchanges, numbers read and repeated, the tone of men who were not worried so much as newly attentive. If you had climbed to the course in those weeks and looked south, you would have seen it plainly for the first time. Not two separate constructions inching along in isolation, but a single line, broken only by a sliver of open sky, the northern deck and the southern deck reading almost as one continuous shape from that distance, waiting on the last few strokes of the jacks to close what remained. The valley had not narrowed, only the promise had, drawing itself tight toward the moment the two lines would finally answer each other. You would have felt the change before you understood it, if you had been standing on the course in those final days, a difference not in what you could see, but in what the wind carried. The sight had grown quieter in the way that a kitchen grows quiet just before a meal is served, when every hand already knows its task, and there is nothing left to say aloud. Two crews on two banks, who had spent years measuring toward each other across 700 meters of open air, were now measuring in millimeters. The whole enormous apparatus of the build, the piers, the jacks, the temporary towers, the launching noses reaching out like two fingers over the gorge, had been built for exactly this narrowing, and now the narrowing was almost done. It helps to remember what had actually been happening underneath all that patient language of progress. The deck was not lifted into place the way you might lift a beam onto a shelf. It was pushed. From each bank, in sections cast and welded behind the abutments, the roadway had been sliding forward on its own weight, inch by inch, riding on pads of steel and Teflon set atop the piers, nosed forward by hydraulic rams that gripped and released, the way a caterpillar draws itself along a branch. You do not hear drama in a description like that, and there was none intended in the work itself. It was a slow, repeated, almost breathing motion, and it had been going on north and south for longer than a year. By the time the gap had closed to something you could have thrown a stone across, both decks had already survived every test that mattered. The wind, the temperature swings that made steel lengthen and shrink by measurable amounts between morning and afternoon, the sheer unglamorous arithmetic of keeping a structure of that mass moving in a straight and level line. What remained was not a question of whether the two halves would meet. The geometry had answered that question years earlier, at the drafting tables, long before any pier had risen from the valley floor. What remained was whether they would meet cleanly, whether the enormous discipline of the build, sustained over every one of those seasons, would still hold true in its final meter. This is the part of the story where you might expect noise, and there was very little of it. The men who did this work were not given to spectacle, and the sight around them had never rewarded it. What you would have seen, had you climbed up to the level of the deck itself in those days, was a great deal of quiet checking. Surveyors with their instruments set on tripods at the pier heads, sighting along lines that had been re-established and re-verified more times than anyone could easily count. Engineers comparing readings taken at dawn, when the steel was cool and had not yet begun to lengthen in the sun, against readings taken again in the last hour of daylight, when the whole deck had grown warm and reached a little further into the gap than it had that morning. The bridge, it turned out, breathed with the day, expanding and settling by a margin measured in centimeters across its great length, and no closing could be attempted without accounting for that breadth. You do not have to hold on to the specifics of how a structure moves with temperature to feel the strangeness of it, that something so vast and so still to the eye was, in fact, never quite motionless, never quite the same length twice in a day. The engineers understood this the way a sailor understands a tide, not as a problem to be solved once, but as a condition to be worked around continuously, checked against, weighted out. The final alignment, when it came, had to happen at a chosen hour, a moment when the temperature of the two advancing sections could be brought close enough together that the last gap between them would sit within the tolerance the design allowed, a tolerance so narrow that the men measuring it spoke of it in millimeters, the kind of margin you might associate with a machine part, rather than with something that stretched across an entire river valley. There is a kind of comfort in that precision, if you let yourself sit with it a moment. So much of this build had been about withstanding forces too large to fully picture. Wind loads, the dead weight of steel measured in tens of thousands of tons, water pressure 200 meters below at the base of a caisson. And here, at the very end, all of that resolved into something almost delicate. Two edges of steel, inching toward each other in the cool of a chosen morning, watched by men with levels and theodolites who spoke, if they spoke at all, in short numbers and shorter conformations. If your eyes are already closing, that is exactly the rhythm to let them close to. The slow, careful hush of measurement, repeated until it is right. But what does it actually take to close a gap that has taken years to shrink? What happens in the hour when the answer finally comes? The final approach was not attempted in one motion. You would have watched the jacks advance the deck in small, checked increments, each one followed by a pause, a fresh round of readings, a comparison against the figures from the pass before. The men operating the hydraulics worked from instruction, not instinct at this stage. Every stroke of the ram called out and logged, so that if anything drifted out of line, the drift could be traced back to a specific movement rather than discovered too late, buried in a joint no one could see. This was the same discipline that had carried the whole viaduct up from the valley floor, the same insistence on measuring twice, on trusting the instrument over the eye, and now it was being asked to deliver its final proof. Somewhere on the northern bank, in those last hours, stood the foreman who had been with the deck since its very first section left the casting yard. The same steady presence, weathered a little further by seasons of wind on an exposed steel roadway, who had walked every meter of that advancing structure more times than he could have counted. He was not one of the men calling out the readings. That work belonged to the surveyors and the engineers with their instruments. His task, as it had been from the beginning, was to know the deck itself, to feel through years of familiarity, whether a section moved the way it should, whether a sound from the launching pads belonged there or did not. Men like him rarely appear in the reports that survive from a build like this, and this one is no exception. What is recorded is the achievement, not the individual footsteps that carried it forward. But it is worth remembering, as the two halves of that deck crept toward each other, that somebody who had watched the whole thing rise was standing close enough to see it finished, the way a carpenter stands near the door he has hung, waiting to see if it swings true. When the last measured gap had closed to the figure the engineers had been waiting for, a distance that, by the accounts that survive, had shrunk to something you could have measured with an ordinary tape rather than an instrument, the final connection was not celebrated with anything like a ceremony. There was no cutting of a ribbon here, no crowd gathered to watch. The work of joining two halves of a steel deck is a welding and bolting operation, methodical and slow, performed by men who had done this exact procedure at every other splice along the length of the bridge, and who now did it once more, in a location that happened to matter more than the others only because it was the last. You would have heard the same sounds you had heard at every other joint on that deck. The low chatter of tools, calls back and forth confirming torque and alignment, nothing raised in triumph. What you would have noticed if you had been standing at a distance and simply watching faces was relief rather than celebration. The particular quiet that comes after a held breath is finally let out, rather than the noise that comes after a race is won. Men who had spent years accounting for wind and heat and the unseen movement of 200 meters of empty air between them did not throw their arms up when the numbers finally agreed. They checked the numbers again. Then, satisfied, they moved on to the next task, because there was still a great deal of work ahead, and no one on that site had ever been the type to stand still for long over a job well done. Word did travel, of course, quietly, from the deck down to the site offices and out along the temporary roads that still served the Cosse. A bridge that had been two separate ambitions for years was now, for the first time, one continuous line of steel, stretching without interruption from one side of the gorge to the other. There is something worth sitting with in that fact alone, without any embellishment. For the length of an ordinary working day, men had walked out onto a deck that ended in open air on one side of the valley and, at the far edge of that same day, could in principle have walked the entire distance across had the surface been finished enough to allow it. The valley that had swallowed traffic for so many years, that had forced every car and lorry down into its narrow floor and back up the far side, was now spanned by something whole. It would be some time yet before that deck carried anything at all, before the barriers were fixed, the surface laid, the lighting run along its edges. The masts that would eventually rise from the piers to carry the cables were still to come, along with the long and delicate work of stringing steel through open air until the whole structure found its final settled shape. But the joining itself, quiet as it was, marked the end of the part of the build that had asked the most of patience and precision together. The slow answering of one bank by the other, finished at last with nothing more dramatic to mark it than a handful of readings that for the first time agreed exactly. There is a particular quiet that settles over a bridge once its two halves have found each other, and if you had been standing on the deck that afternoon, you might almost have missed the moment the last measurement was taken because nothing about it looked like an ending. The surface stretched away from you in both directions, pale and unbroken, already carrying the faint smell of new asphalt, already dressed with the low steel rails that would one day guide cars past at speed. But look up, and you would have seen that the work was nowhere near finished. Each pier still ended in a bare concrete head, flat and waiting, like a candle without its flame. The masts that would eventually rise from those heads, and the webs of cable that would hang from the masts down to the deck on either side, existed only on paper and in the quiet certainty of the people who had drawn them. You do not need to hold on to any of that. It is enough to know that the hardest waiting was over and the last climb was about to begin. The foreman had been on the site long enough by now that the younger riggers had started asking him things they would once have asked no one, the kind of small, practical questions that only get answered by someone who has already made every mistake worth making. He had come up through the piers, through the deck, through the long, patient months of watching concrete cure and steel find its line, and now, with the crossing finally joined, his attention turned upward again, toward work that would take place higher above the valley than anything that had come before it. If the piers had asked for nerve and the deck had asked for patience, the masts and cables would ask for something closer to precision under pressure, because from here on, small errors would not simply sit quietly in the structure. They would announce themselves, quite literally, as a lean, a sag, an imbalance visible from the road below. Each mast was a slender steel form, tapering as it rose, built not on site, but assembled from prefabricated steel sections, not unlike the deck itself, though far smaller and far more delicate in appearance. You would have seen them arrive by road in pieces, stacked on low trailers, looking almost modest until they were stood upright, and you understood how they were meant to be read against the sky, not as separate towers bolted to the bridge, but as a continuation of the pier beneath them. Concrete becoming steel, becoming line, so that from a distance the whole assembly seemed to taper from the valley floor to a single point far overhead. That effect did not happen by accident. It was there in the earliest drawings, back when the bridge existed only as a proposal competing against heavier, more conventional designs, and it remained a condition that Norman Foster insisted upon even now, at this late and highly technical stage of the build. Engineers could have argued, reasonably, for masts that were simpler to fabricate, stockier, easier to stiffen against wind. Foster's contribution, all the way through, had been to keep pulling the design back toward slenderness, toward a silhouette that read as effortless from any angle, even though nothing about achieving that silhouette was effortless at all. Raising each mast into position meant lifting a load of a few hundred tons to a height where the wind behaved less like a nuisance and more like a working condition to be planned around, using cranes mounted on the deck itself, since nothing on the ground below could have reached that high with any accuracy. You can picture what it would have felt like to stand near the base of a pier and watch one of those masts inching skyward, swinging almost imperceptibly, held by cables of its own, before it had a single cable of its own permanently attached. The riggers who guided it into its final seating did so by hand signal and short-shouted correction, because at that height the wind takes half of anything spoken and scatters it before it reaches anyone. The foreman was not doing that work himself any longer. His knees and his years had earned him a place slightly back from the edge, but he was there for every one of the 7 liftings, watching the same sequence of adjustments he had once made himself on smaller structures, checking that the crews below understood not just what to do, but why the sequence mattered. Why one mast could not simply be dropped into place and left while another was still being fitted. Once a mast stood on its pier, plumb and bolted, it looked for a while like a strange and slightly forlorn object. A single tall spine with nothing yet growing from it, waiting for the cables that would eventually make it look less like a mast and more like a piece of the bridge. You would have needed to return some weeks later to see that change begin, because the cables did not arrive altogether, and they were not installed casually. Each one was drawn up from the deck to an anchorage point on the mast, then tensioned by degrees, and the order in which that happened across the whole length of the bridge mattered every bit as much as the order in which the deck sections had once been pushed out over the valley. If your eyes are already closing, that is exactly the right response to what comes next, because the tensioning of a cable-stayed bridge is not a dramatic process to watch. It is closer to tuning an enormous, motionless instrument, one string at a time, listening the whole way through for balance rather than sound. But how do you stretch cable across open air, hundreds of meters above a valley floor, without the whole structure twisting out of true as you go? That is really the question the second half of this work turns on, and it is worth sitting with for a moment, because the answer says a great deal about how differently a cable-stayed bridge behaves compared to almost anything built before it. A cable is not like a beam or a pier. It carries no load at all until it is pulled taut, and once it is pulled taut, it begins immediately to pull back on the mast above it, drawing the tower toward the center of the span, and on the deck below it, lifting and steadying the very section it is meant to support. Attach one cable in isolation, tension it fully, and you have not solved a problem so much as created a new and slightly alarming one, because the mast will lean toward that cable, and the deck beneath it will rise unevenly, and every other part of the bridge will feel that shift, however faintly, through its own structure. The engineers who had shaped this stage of the project, working from calculations Michel Virlogeux and his colleagues had refined years earlier during the design itself, treated the cables not as fittings to be bolted on once the frame existed, but as active participants in the bridge's final geometry. Each one had a prescribed tension, calculated to sit in balance with all the others, and the order of installation followed a careful, almost musical logic. A little tension here, on this pier, on that side of the mast, then a matching adjustment on the opposite side, then a small correction 2 piers along, because the whole deck was, in a sense, listening to itself as the work went on, transmitting the smallest changes in load from one span to the next along its entire length. You did not tension a cable and walk away. You tensioned it part way, moved to another, returned later, tightened further, checked the deck's level with instruments sensitive enough to notice a rise of only a few millimeters, and adjusted again. It was slow work, deliberately slow, the kind that resists any attempt to rush it, and if this is the part of the story where your attention starts to drift, there is nothing wrong with that. The bridge itself was built by people willing to let a single joint take a whole afternoon to get right. Standing beneath one of the completed fans of cable, looking straight up, you would have seen something that resembled a house of glinting thread more than a piece of engineering. 11 pairs of steel strands per mast, spreading from a single high point down to evenly spaced anchorages along the deck, catching whatever light was available at that hour and holding it in thin, bright lines against the sky. From the road and later from cars crossing at speed, that fan would read as pure elegance, exactly the impression Foster had first sketched years before any pier had been sunk into the valley floor. From underneath, standing where the workers stood, it read instead as a network of forces in careful, deliberate argument with one another, each cable pulling against its neighbors, each mast balanced not by rigidity but by opposition, tension against tension, all the way along the crossing. The foreman's part in this final stage was quieter than it had been at any point before. He walked the deck during the tensioning, checked in with the surveying teams whose instruments now mattered more than any hand tool on the site, and stood, more often than not, simply watching, not because there was nothing for him to do, but because the work had shifted into a register where his decades of feel for concrete and steel gave way to instruments reading fractions of a degree and fractions of a millimeter. He had raised the piers by eye and instinct as much as by drawing in the earliest years of the project. He ended it standing beside engineers who trusted numbers on a screen over the tilt of a plumb line. That, too, is simply how a project like this moves, from the raw and physical toward the exact and instrumented, without ever quite leaving either behind. He would appear once more before the story closes, on the day the bridge was finally opened to the vehicles that would use it for the rest of its working life. But for now, his role recedes quietly into the background, the way a foreman's role always does once the last of the difficult decisions have been made and only the fine adjustments remain. By the time the final cable reached its prescribed tension, the bridge no longer looked like a project in progress at all. Each pier carried its mast, each mast carried its fan of cable, and the deck ran level and steady between them, exactly as the drawings had promised it would all those years earlier, when the whole idea had still been a set of lines on a competition board rather than steel and concrete standing over a real valley. What remained was not construction in the sense the site had known it for years past, but verification. Instruments checking what hands and cranes had built, engineers confirming that the structure behaved under its own weight and under the first tentative loads placed upon it, exactly as the calculations said it should. That quiet, careful process of proving the bridge to itself was still to come, and it would ask its own kind of patience from everyone still on site, one final test before anything resembling a road would open. You come back now to the bridge itself, finished, standing in the last low light of a valley evening, and it no longer looks like anything that was built by hand. It looks like something the land grew, or something the sky lowered into place while no one was watching. You have walked this site through mud and scaffold and the smell of fresh concrete for so many pages of this story that it takes a moment, standing here, to let yourself simply look at it the way a stranger would, arriving with no memory of the years beneath it. Start where the road first meets the structure, at the northern end, where the causeway rises gently out of the plateau as though it were reluctant to admit how far above the ground it is about to go. From here the deck runs arrow straight and then bends, almost imperceptibly, in a curve so long and so gentle that your eye cannot find where it begins. That curve was not decoration. It was Norman Foster's answer to a problem of monotony and of sightlines, a shallow arc drawn across nearly the whole width of the valley so that a driver crossing it would never see the far end waiting dead ahead, and so that no single pier would ever quite block another from view. Virlogeux had given the bridge its bones. Foster had given it this, the sense that a road could still be a gesture, not merely a route. Standing here now, you can feel both of their decisions at once, the engineer's arithmetic and the architect's patience, resolved into a single unbroken line. Let it wash over you slowly, the way the whole valley opens beneath that line. 7 piers carry the deck across the gap, evenly spaced, each one narrower than the last as they step down toward the river and then climb again toward the southern plateau, following the shape of the ground below rather than fighting it. From where you stand, you can pick them out one by one, pale against the darkening hills, tapering as they rise so that each looks lighter at its head than at its foot, an illusion of ease built into tens of thousands of tons of concrete. There is nothing you need to hold on to here, no figure worth memorizing, only the shape of the thing settling into your mind the way a skyline does when you have looked at it long enough to stop counting its parts. The second of those piers, the one nearest the river on the northern side, is the one every account of this bridge returns to, and standing beneath it you understand why before anyone tells you the number. It rises so far above the valley floor that its own base disappears into shadow long before dusk reaches its head, and its summit holds a mast that keeps climbing well past the point where you would expect a bridge to stop. That single pier, measured from its footing in the Tarn Valley to the tip of the mast it carries, reaches higher into the air than the Eiffel Tower reaches above Paris, taller by a margin that surprised even people who had watched it being built. You do not have to remember the exact figure to feel the truth of it. You only have to stand where you are standing now and notice that your neck aches from looking up. But what is it like, you might ask, to actually be on that deck, moving across the valley rather than looking at it from below? And does a structure this large feel like triumph from up there, or does it feel like something quieter? That question deserves its own unhurried answer, and it is worth walking out onto the deck itself to find one. From the roadway, none of the drama you feel from below survives in the same way. The parapets are low, the barriers modest, and for long stretches the eye is drawn less to the piers than to the sky itself, because the deck was built to feel less like a bridge and more like an extension of the plateau you have just left, a road that simply continues where the land runs out. That was deliberate too. Foster had spoken of wanting drivers to cross without feeling that they were crossing anything at all, to have the valley pass beneath them almost unnoticed, the way a thought passes without quite becoming a memory. You can test that for yourself if you imagine driving it at speed. The piers slide past at long, calm intervals. The cables flicker overhead in a rhythm too regular to alarm anyone, and the drop beneath you, real as it is, keeps itself out of your immediate view until you choose to look for it. Choose to look for it now, though, because you have earned it after everything this story has asked you to sit through. Lean, in your mind, toward the edge and let the valley open under you the way it opens under the deck itself, all the way down to the river that once made this crossing take the better part of an afternoon in traffic, now reduced to a silver thread far beneath your feet. The height at the deck's lowest point above that river is close to 270 meters, a distance that puts the roadway above most of the tall buildings you have ever stood beside and holds it, at the time it was finished, above almost every other bridge deck ever raised anywhere in the world. You feel that height less as a number and more as a kind of quiet in your chest, the particular hush that comes from being somewhere your body knows it has no business standing, held up by cable and steel and the patient calculations of people who never doubted it would hold. Above you, if you tilt your head back from the deck, the masts climb further still, each pier's mast rising in its own slender diamond of steel, and from each mast, the cables fan downward and outward to the deck in two long, even sheets, 11 pairs to a mast, catching whatever light is left in the sky and turning it into thin, bright lines against the blue. It was here, in this final stretched geometry of steel against air, that the whole logic of the bridge revealed itself completely for the first time. The reason the piers had to be shaped the way they were, tapering to carry the mast's load down cleanly. The reason the deck had to be as light and as stiff as the launch had made it so that the cables could hold it without strain. The reason every decision made years earlier in a drafting office and every difficult afternoon spent jacking a deck section forward a few centimeters at a time had been aimed all along at this exact silhouette. The young rigger who had once climbed those temporary towers to guide the deck's leading edge into place, one of the many whose names the record never kept, would have known this shape from underneath long before anyone else saw it finished, would have felt each cable go taut for the first time under his own hands before it ever caught the evening light for a stranger's eyes. Walk the whole length of it now, in your mind, from the plateau in the north to the plateau in the south, and let the distance itself be the thing you carry away. The viaduct runs for a little under 2,500 meters, end to end, a span long enough that from one side you cannot always make out the details of the other, and it does this not as a single leap, but as a sequence. 8 spans stitched one to the next across 7 piers, each juncture so precisely aligned that the deck reads, from any distance, as one unbroken piece of steel rather than 8 separate lengths jacked forward from the plateau over the course of a long and careful winter. That seamlessness was the entire purpose of the launch you have already lived through in this story, the reason for every tolerance checked and rechecked, every degree of temperature accounted for in the steel's own quiet expansion and contraction. Here, finished, it no longer looks like the outcome of that struggle. It looks like it was always going to be this simple. There is a particular kind of morning. Those who have seen it say, when the valley fills with cloud before dawn and the bridge alone stands clear above it, its piers vanishing into white below the deck so that the roadway and its masts seem to float unsupported over nothing at all, a line of steel suspended in open sky with no valley beneath it and no ground in sight. It is the image that gave this bridge its second name before it had even opened, the one that outlasted every technical description written about it. And it is the image worth keeping now as your own eyes grow heavy. Not the piers, not the tonnage, not the sequence of jacks and cables that put it all in place, but simply a bridge standing above the clouds, patient, finished, Indifferent to the valley it no longer needs to touch in order to belong to it. That is where this story rests tonight, on that quiet, floating line of steel, and there is nothing more of it you need to carry into sleep. Thank you for spending these 2 hours with me, wherever in the telling your eyes finally closed. If it was somewhere back on the causeway, or partway through the piers, or right here at the end, it makes no difference at all. The bridge was always going to still be standing in the morning, whichever part of the story you were with when you drifted off. If you'd like, there are other great structures waiting for you here whenever you need something calm to fall asleep to. For now, though, just let the valley stay quiet. Let the clouds stay low and rest. The valley does not need you to keep watching it, and neither does the bridge. Somewhere below the cloud line, water keeps moving the way it moved before any of this was built, patient with or without an audience. And somewhere above it, steel holds its shape in darkness the same as it did in daylight, needing no one to notice. If you are still here, eyes half open, let the last thing you picture be small rather than vast, not the whole span, not the height, just one cable catching a last thread of light before the dark takes it too. That is enough to end on. Nothing further is asked of you, no figure to hold, no name to keep. The bridge will still be standing when the sun finds it again, cloud or no cloud, and you do not have to be awake for that to be true. Rest now. The valley keeps its own hours, and so tonight can you.